So I am Tomaso, and after the IUC I went for a PhD in law at Sciences Po University in Paris. It took 4 years. I recently defended and obtained the title, and I will be starting working tomorrow at Warwick in the UK. So that's my last day in Italy, and I'm so happy that I'm spending here at the IUC instead of at home crying, because I will now have access to nice and local and organic food for a while. So what I'm trying to present today is totally related with what Nora discussed, and also will link with what Luigi is going to present afterwards. And the idea is that I'm trying to focus on that 20% of food that circulates all over the world, that actually cross boundaries, and that somehow is at the center of development policies, at the center of trade policies, that everyone is looking at. But I'm not looking at that in order to support it and to say that transnational food chains are good. I'm actually looking at that to see how lawyers and committed lawyers, as I would like to be, can do something in order to reduce the level of exploitation, actually to get rid of the exploitation. And when I talk about exploitation, that's an extremely complicated and undefined word, but I mean more or less the production of negative externality, which is costs that are not supported by those that are producing them. And that means exploiting labor, so underpaid labor or having slave labor, but also environmental costs, and all those costs that are making the system unsustainable. I was supposed to start 15 minutes ago and to finish 15 minutes from now. I will do my best in order to be short. I don't know how easy that will be, but I have not so many slides. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. 4 main points. I will start with the idea of the fetishism of the commodity, but I will explain it in a very simple way. And the fetishism of the commodity is, I think, the link between every one of us and the global value chain system, the system of international trade of goods. Then I look from a legal perspective at the role that law has in constructing these chains of exploitation, transportation, and consumption that we can call global value chains, that we can call supply chain capitalism. That is more or less the dominant economic system that it's developing and it's consolidating at the international level. My third part is dedicated to an example, because I think that the examples are useful to give a better idea of what's actually happening, what we can do. And the last point is my idea of legal chokeholds, which is a link between activism, legal activism, and the system of production. So the fetishism of the commodity is not something that I invented, it's not something that I came out with, but is an idea that is deeply rooted in Marxist and neo-Marxist theories. And it is that if we go and have a coffee, as Ugo was saying at the beginning, and we sip it, we can think that what we are doing is just consuming a good, it's just feeling pleasure because we are eating something. But we can actually look at what we are doing, at the good, at the food that we are consuming, at our action, and try to understand the complexity that lies behind that. So I'm using sugar here, but really you can do that with all the food that probably you're consuming, everything that surrounds us, from the bottled water that is something that we should never ever have at the IUC. You can actually ask yourselves, where does it come from? And what are the power struggles, what are the clashes that are behind the commodity thing that we are consuming. So we stay with sugar. We can start, for example, asking what's the geographical complexity of sugar. So if we focus on sugar cane and not beetroot sugar, if we focus on sugar cane, we can see in the lower part of the screen where sugar cane is mainly produced today. And in the upper part of the screen, we can see where sugar is mostly consumed today. And so one of the patterns of investigation that we could have is like, how is it that products that are mainly coming from the global south, as you can see, are mainly consumed in the north? And the other pattern that we could have is overlapping, taking the south, the image in the lower part of the screen, and overlapping it with the map of colonies of the colonial time until 1960s and today. And we would definitely see that there is a relationship between the production, the places and geographies of sugar production, and the places and places and geographies of colonization. And even more interesting, there is somehow an overlapping between the core of the colonial empire, so the UK mainly for what concerns sugar, and the geographies of sugar production. So one of the things that you can think of when we consume sugar, we add sugar to our coffee, or we even drink a soda that has a lot of sugar inside, is that we are consuming something that has a very complex geography behind it that we often forget of. But the other level of complexity, and that's what I'm more interested in, is the complexity of the production. It's the complexity of the relationship between labor and capital, the complexity of transportation, the complexity of the logistics, the complexity and the dense system that brings sugar cane that is coming from somewhere in the periphery, from a former colony, all the way to the consumers, mainly in the global north. If you remember the picture that I showed before, the United States is the first consumer of sugar per capita in the world. So what is bringing sugar that is coming from Latin America, that is coming from African countries to the United States? That's a very complex system that involves farmers, that involves transportation, that involves refining, that involves many layers that are all lying behind and are somehow invisible behind the cube of sugar that we are consuming. But I think what is even more interesting from a legal perspective is that this complex scenario, this global value chain where goods are transformed and transported, has a lot to do with law, and law has a lot to do with that in the sense that, from my perspective, we can analyze that complexity from a legal point of view and ask ourselves, how is law involved in creating this chain of production, and how can we use law in order to change it? And if we are critical lawyers, if we are committed lawyers, we can ask ourselves, how can we use law to redistribute value, to redistribute power throughout the chain? So that's more or less what I'm trying to do. So on one side, I try to reconstruct legally the chain of production, and on the other side, I try to use law to redefine it and reallocate power. So my starting point is the idea of global value chains. It's a very hot topic, it's very appealing. Everyone is talking about global value chains. You can get the World Bank, you can get the FAO, you have farmers talking about value chains. And the simple fact that so many different institutions and people are talking about value chains should make you being skeptical, because that means that everyone is trying to impose its own version, its own vision of the value chain. So you can have institutions like the World Bank saying that global value, as Nora was saying, that global value chains and becoming part of global value chains is a developing strategy, that countries should just jump on global value chains and become part of the global market. And you have farmers on the other side that are saying that global value chains and foreign investments are destroying their livelihood. They are talking about the same thing, and they're saying that these same words mean the opposite for them. So every time that you read global value chains, just pay attention. But from a researcher point of view, there are at least three ways in which value chains are defined. The first one is the one of political economy, and value chains are seen as linkages and links between different steps. If you remember the picture that I showed before, people like Giraffe and all the political economists that started the idea of global value chains are just interested in how is it that the lead firm, let's say Coca-Cola, that is the biggest firm in the chain of sugar and soda production, how is it that Coca-Cola talks to the suppliers, how is it that Coca-Cola manages to get the products whenever Coca-Cola wants, with the quality that they want. So the importance for them on the value chain is that of organization and connections. So they're not really interested in power, they're not really interested in distribution, they are not really interested in the struggles, they're just interested in how can I make the process smooth and how can I make the process work, so that whenever I need Coca-Cola on the shelves in the supermarket, I'm going to have Coca-Cola. Then there is, luckily, a more legally oriented and legally based analysis of value chains that is not only interested in delivering products, but is also interested in understanding the legal complexity of the chain, and that's what I define the mainstream law and global value chain analysis. Mainly they look at property and contract. So what they look at is how is property defined and used, so who owns resources, who has the power to conclude contracts, how is the bargaining power distributed. So when employer and employees come to the table and they sign a labor contract, how is that defined and what are the struggles, but also contracts between a supplier and a provider, and contracts between the final consumer and the supermarket. So there are lawyers interested in global value chains, but it's a very technical analysis and saying A and B, they're signing a contract and these are the consequences and that's it. I think that what I'm trying to do is going beyond that and really focusing on the allocation of power and the allocation of resources, and seeing how law is intervening in really putting institutes like corporations, communities, and states in the position in which they are. So I'm not just saying corporation X owns the land in Mali. I'm just saying what are the legal structures that facilitate the fact that a corporation is concluding this agreement with the state, and what are the legal structures that are putting communities in a very marginalized place so they have no possibility of intervention. So that's somehow the condensation of the three pictures that I showed you. I want to use the geographical complexity with the complexity of production and really move beyond the idea of property and contract, move beyond the idea that things only are determined by what we can see immediately, and look at the legal structure and the legal arrangements that operate beyond that. And to give you an example that I hope will clarify things, I want to use the case of Cambodia. So the Cambodia is unfortunately very well known by all the scholars and activists working on the issue of land grabbing and working on exploitation of land and farmers, because in the last, I would say, 10 years, the government of Cambodia is really bought into the rhetoric of development through international trade. So the Cambodian government has been following the pattern proposed by the World Bank and some development institutions that opening to foreign capital and opening to foreign investors and producing commodities, producing goods for export is the way to develop and to move on. So that's the main reason why I chose Cambodia, because it's unfortunately a very good example of how things can go bad. And the second, or actually a good example of the rhetoric, but at the same time is a good example of how things can go bad, and I will show you in the next slide. The policy and the decision of the government have led to thousands and thousands of hectares of land that has been enclosed, and thousands of families that have been kicked out of their land. So what I'm trying to do is to look at what happened and to look at how law has something to do with that. So how law is part of the problem, how law facilitates and legalizes the process of enclosure and eviction, and how could we use law and global value chain in a way to open new spaces of confrontation. That's an exemplification of what I was saying. Look at the data. They are starting from they start from 2000 right to 2014. You can see between 2004 on, that's 2004 on, the number of land conflicts and the number of families that were evicted and the number of families that lost the land on which they were living. So if we look at that, and specifically we look at the case of Koh Kong province, which is the case study that I analyzed most deeply in my PhD. We look at that, we see eviction, we see the police violence, we see the government sending the police to evict people and burn down houses. And so we, as lawyers or people interested in justice, we could look at that and say, okay, so people involved are, the actors involved are the communities, the corporation, and the state. So we only have to focus on these three actors. And we have to find a way in which these three actors, the power and the opportunities and the resources are redefined. So we should stop the corporation, we should stop with the government, and we should have the community staying on their land. Unfortunately, as we were discussing before, the government is not, in this specific case particularly, is siding with the corporation. So you have communities on one side and the corporation and the state on the other side working together. And the way in which they work together has a lot to do with law, and has a lot to do with the idea that the government is helping, is using legal instruments to transform the land that belongs to the community, to transform communal communal land into a factor of production. So what the government is doing is taking the land that belongs to the community and just putting that in the hands of the corporation so that value can be extracted and made from that. And that's happening, as I was saying, by means of law. And as a lawyer, I'm interested in understanding how that's happening, because if I can map the way in which that's happening, I may have the opportunity to find weaknesses and to find places of intervention to change the dynamics and maybe open new scenarios. So these are just some of the ways in which law has a lot to do with the enclosure of land in Cambodia. And we can start from the domestic level, from the local level. The simplest thing is the government issues a land reform and says that whoever claims the title over the land in the next 6 months will be granted the title if they can prove the ownership. Otherwise, the rest of the land is going to become public land. And so that happened not only in Cambodia but in many other places in the world. And a lot of families didn't know about that. A lot of families were not informed. A lot of families didn't go and register. But because the law was saying whoever doesn't register after 6 months just doesn't have the title and the land belongs to the public, automatically thousands and thousands and thousands of hectares who were occupied and were lived by generation of people automatically moves into the public realm. And that's again has a lot to do with law. Law that only recognizes the distinction and the separation between private property on one side and public property on the other side. That's a legal decision, that's a legal choice. It is not the only one that can be done. There are the commons that represent the third way or alternative. There is common land recognized in many countries of the world, including the UK. But if in case of Cambodia, that's not the case. The legislation and the proprietary regime only recognizes the alternative, and whatever fits in between is somehow trapped between the power of the private on one side and the power and the authority of the public on the other side. Then you also have the economic concession. You have many ways in which the government is directly involved in transforming communal land into a factor of production. But when I analyzed that, I thought that was not enough. I thought that only looking at what was happening in Cambodia would have put too much pressure and too much responsibility on the Cambodian government and on the corporation operating in Cambodia, which I totally recognize, and I see the Cambodian government as part of the problem, if not one of the biggest responsible in the fact of eviction and enclosure. But there is an entire different level of law that has a lot to do with the global production and global trade. And that's what I define as international, though it's not that easy to really, like international is not appropriate. And as a lawyer, I was interested in that. And I looked at the role of bilateral investment agreements, for example. So governments conclude international agreements, and after they conclude international agreements, they somehow have to recognize foreign investors and to guarantee them a level of protection that is higher than the protection from a legal perspective that local and national investors receive. So I was looking at what's the implication on the ground of these bilateral investment agreements. So we think that bilateral investment agreements only have to do with trade, but eventually bilateral investment agreements have a lot to do with the life of people on the ground, and we never really think of that. And we never really think of bilateral investment agreements as a place that we should look at and resist against if we're really interested in justice and in the life of people. Then I looked at the WTO, although it's not my field of expertise, and there are people in the room who know much better than I do. But there are some judgments of the WTO that have an indirect impact on what happened in Cambodia. And for example, in the case of WTO, the WTO sanctioned the European Union because of the subsidies that the European Union was giving on sugar production. So once the WTO ruling, actually two rulings of the field body came out, Europe had to change its policy towards sugar procurement. So sugar was mainly procured in Europe from sugar beet. And after the WTO ruling, the European corporations that were producing and refining sugar had to find sugar somewhere else. And most of them went to Cambodia. And they went to Cambodia because of another piece of legislation that is not a Cambodian piece of legislation, that has nothing to do with Cambodia, but that has an impact on the allocation of power in Cambodia. And that's the everything but arms incentives, the everything but arms structure of the European Union that says whoever exports from some countries, those least developed countries, goods that are not arms, like not weapons. If you export like sugar, if you export other kind of commodity, textile or garments, you have 0 duties to export and you receive an incentive. So on one side you have European in desperate need for cheaper sugar. On the other side you have the European Union saying, if you go and produce sugar in Cambodia, I will not put any duty on you importing to Europe. So you see that these two legislation, these two pieces of law, like one from the WTO and the other one from the European Union, reshuffle and changes completely incentives and the power dynamics behind the government, the investors, and the farmers. Because of course at a certain moment in Cambodia, and it really starts when you see the land conflicts increase, you see the government of Cambodia bombed by the investors and surrounded by investors who really wanted the land and were ready to pay, they were ready to bribe, they were ready to give money. And on the other side, the farmers who had nothing to do with that and could not really determine directly what was happening at the European level or the WTO level, because of course at the WTO level, Cambodia was not even involved in the process. And the list goes on. Like there are so many of these pieces of law and these legal structures that are not geographically confined to Cambodia or to any other country that you may be interested in, that have a lot to do with the dynamics and the distribution of power that are proper in Cambodia. So if the problem, if the evictions, if the exploitation depends on multiple layers of law, my question is, how can I use these multiple layers of law, this multi-territoriality of law, and this legal complexity to subvert the system or to find alternatives, to think differently, and to open new spaces? How can I, instead of acting in Cambodia, can I do something somewhere else that redefines power in a way that I think is more compatible with my political desire? So the case of Cambodia is very, very interesting because between 2006 and 2013, local farmers with the support of some NGOs and like local NGOs and international NGOs, they started almost 13 different actions between purely legal actions and quasi-legal actions and lobby actions to target different actors that are more or less related with land in Cambodia, but what they really are related to is the value chain, is the production chain. So they started actions in Cambodia. There was the simplest one, the easiest one, against the corporation and against the state. They started a civil case and a criminal case. They didn't get any answer. So they went and looked who was the investor, and they saw that the investor was a Thai corporation. So they started an action in Thailand against the Thai corporation. And actually the judge there said that there were some violations of law that should have been prosecuted. So with that positive outcome, they went to a regional court in the area, the Asian, which is the economic area of some Asian countries, and they made the same claim. But then they say, okay, so where is sugar going? What's happening with our sugar? And they realized on one side that there was the problem with the European Union and the role that the European Union law was having in creating and giving incentives to exploitation of land in Cambodia. But on the other side, they saw and they realized that it was a UK company that was buying Cambodian sugar and refining it. So they abandoned the geography of the region and they go to Europe and they start a case against the European Union, more than a case, as a lobbying action in Europe, asking for the abolition of the preferential measures in favor of Cambodia. And at the same time, they start an action against the British company that was buying sugar. So at that moment, what they're trying to do is saying, even if the only link that they have is that they're buying, they're still belonging to the same chain of production. So how can I use law in an imaginative and innovative way to change the way in which the chain is constructed? And what they're trying to do in the UK is very, very interesting. What they're saying is, if you're buying sugar that is obtained from land that has been taken with violence from people, you are buying a product that has been stolen. So you are in possession of a stolen good, so you have to give back the good and give back all the interest that have been generated out of the good. So if they were successful, but that's not so likely, unfortunately, they would be totally change the dynamics. So because a company that has been taking advantage of and exploiting sugar, like buying cheap sugar for 3 years and making a lot of money out of that, should be forced to recognize the right of the people who were exploited and give the money, even if the company was not the company that kicked the communities out, just because they were buying sugar that was taken from them. And then I think that there is the third level of intervention that has to do with the financial aspect of all of that. So they looked at production and they identified those actors that had something to do because they were directly exploiting or because they were buying an exploited product. But they also look at those actors that are making money just by lending resources, just by because they are banks or they are financial institutions, they are investing in sugar exploitation, or because they are investors who own the shares. So they move beyond the production level and they arrive to the financial level. And so at the same time, they started an action against the Norwegian sovereign fund. There was a shareholder, an investor in the Thai company that was exploiting. They started an action in the United States against one of the shareholders. And they also started an action against an investment fund, a private equity fund that is located in Germany. So what they're doing is to say, let's take advantage of finance of the financial links of the chain, or the financial nature of the chain, as a place where we can exercise some form of resistance. So I think that this shift towards taking advantage of the complexity, understanding and mapping complexity, taking advantage of that, is what I call the critical legal chain approach, and it's what I've been trying to do with my dissertation. It's not that I'm extremely optimistic. It's not that I'm saying, oh, you just have to know how it works and then you find a place where that you can change, or the intervention that you can actually make. But I think it's important from the perspective of a researcher, from an heterodox perspective or from an heterodox approach to production, to understand that complexity is there. Complexity is sometimes it's there because it protects exploitation. So the fact that production is divided and fragmented and there are links that sometimes are hidden, that's what makes corporation being almost non-liable all the time. If you cannot really identify the links, if you don't really know who is behind that, you practically walk in the darkness and you cannot find the accountable. On the other side, what I'm also trying to say is that the complexity, when it comes to food, when it comes to the exploitation of labor, when it comes to other chains, when it comes to garment, and for example, I think and I hope you are familiar with the Rana Plaza disaster, what happened in Bangladesh with thousands of people who died. So you could look at that and say, okay, that's just a matter of who is the owner, who was violating the law, and the state that did not guarantee the safety measures. Or you could also say, as someone started saying, that's also responsibility of the companies that were buying products from Rana Plaza, were actually making money out of the cheap labor in Bangladesh, and start to expand the geographical and legal scenario. And why the reason why I'm somehow optimistic is that at a certain moment throughout the history of the Cambodian case, the company, the parent company who owns the refining company, so the American company who owns the British company, and the only thing that they are doing is that they own shares in the company that is purchased, that is buying sugar. The American company said, oh no, we are not gonna sit down and negotiate, we're not gonna do anything with any kind of mediation, negotiation with the communities until the communities withdraw the case that they filed in the UK. So the company, the capital in itself is recognizing that if you multiply the spaces of resistance, of the spaces where you exercise some pressure, you are actually doing something that they're not expecting. And you're actually using their multi-territoriality, what transnational capital is always doing. Transnational capital always hides behind borders, hides behind frontiers, because it's expecting this geographical distribution and division to protect itself from actions. But if you're capable of following capital and going in multiple places and operating in multiple geographies and in multiple venues, that's somehow changing the rules of the games, and also capital and corporations themselves are not expecting it. So I think that's the thing that is making me optimistic, is that the reaction was such of fear and disappointment because multiple cases were happening at the same time, that I think that there should be an interesting way to go. So that's more or less what I wanted to say, and these are the take-home messages, or the main ideas that I would like to put on the table, and that I hope someone will be interested in developing in the future. I will definitely try to use them in my double life of academic and legal consultant or legal advocate. So the idea is that we really, first of all, we have to understand that law is part of the problem. We have to understand that legal structures and governments and law in itself are not there to help and to claim and to reach justice, but mainly the representation of power. And if we start from that assumption, we can try to do something. We simply think that law is definitely going to provide us with the answer because law is there to reach like, a better life. We remain stuck in the system. The second point that I think is important is to learn from global change scholarship and from this idea of multiplicity, of the complexity and multiplicity of structures and geographies, so that whenever we think of a violation of exploitation that is happening somewhere, we're capable of linking it with multiple geographies. And I think that the third interesting point of that is that lawyers are forced somehow to talk and deal with other disciplines. They are forced not to stay only in their little field or little orchard of law and legal instruments, but they have to talk with economists, they have to talk with people in finance, they have to be deeply rooted and deeply involved with the social movements and with the exploitation. So it's also a way to bring lawyers and committee people out there and not only like put in the calmly and relax them in their offices. And the last point is that if we understand that we map the complexity, we may find new alternatives of legal intervention, and we may find new alternatives of using law at least to stop the process. I'm not claiming that law can be used to fix everything, but at least I think that law can be used to stop the exploitation, the current exploitation, and at least create new spaces for political activism and for political engagement. And that's my very last point. So there's a white guy educated in Europe, a lawyer, talking about Cambodia, and it really sounds like the white man burden. It really sounds like I have the solution, I have the key, and I know everything. Actually, it's rather the opposite. So I learned a lot by being on the ground, but what I learned the most was that everything that I've been developing and the research that I've been doing would be useless if I decided to use it by myself, or if I decided to use it with my clique of people or whatever it might be. I think that the importance of understanding the complexity is that we understand that cooperation, we understand that we all belong to the same economic system, and what happens at the peripheries of the system has a lot to do with what happens here at the core of the system. So as someone from the core of the system, I have to recognize the role that I am playing, that my law is playing, that my government is playing, and recognizing that, cooperating, and trying to work together and work with, rather than just presenting solution and find a better word for the others. I think that we have all to work together, otherwise there is no real opportunity. And that was more or less everything. Oh yeah, so if you're interested, that's a sort of a very short version of my 500 pages PhD. I uploaded an article that talks about that on SSRN, so if you put my name and global value chains, whatever. And I would be very interested in having your feedbacks also on the article, because that's the first time that I presented, so if it made sense or not. And besides that, thanks a lot.